Greetings and God bless. Welcome to another episode of Pastor Mike, Dynamic Voices for a Diverse Church, powered by The Witness, a Black Christian collective. I'm your host, G. Tyler Burns. You can follow me on Instagram at G. Tyler Burns. Please follow at your own risk. I almost said at Burns Clan. Almost went back. See, that's how they get you.
You
go back different. To your old life.
You got to move different.
You can go back to your old life. We moving differently now. As always, my co-host is the founder of The Witness. Very extensive bio. He is the man, the myth, the legend, the 3-time best-selling author. I'll stick with 3. It's fine. Mr. Blue Check Verified himself. You can follow his writings at jemartisby.substack.com. Dr. Jemar Tisby, what's going on, brother?
Same old, man. We back on the mic, and I'm excited to dive into our topic because something everybody been talking about for a while.
And before we get into that, I have to acknowledge, thank you all so much for supporting us, specifically if you are watching us on YouTube.
Hey,
what up?
Moving differently.
We see y'all. Y'all see us. I just want to shout out a couple of people. We had Dr. Malcolm Foley on recently, and that was perhaps the episode of episodes.
I think that's our most watched YouTube video.
Yes, absolutely, without a doubt. And so shout out to Dr. Foley. Please go pick up his book, The Anti-Greed Gospel. But also, I want to shout out a couple of people who left some comments here.
Show some love.
Who said 20 said this is a must-listen conversation. Thank you, brothers, for hosting Dr. Foley. And thank you, Dr. Foley, for doing the research and being a light to guide us out of mammon and into true Jesus generosity. Shout out to you. I also want to shout out Skyland, who left a comment. He said, I'm halfway through this episode and I've concluded that this is one of them ones. I like that.
Halfway through. He already knew.
Shout out to you, Skyland. Listen, thank y'all so much for engaging, interacting with us, leaving comments. Continue to do so. And I think they might be leaving a couple of comments on this episode too, Jemar.
Well, maybe so.
So we're talking about, obviously, the controversial comments that happened. I think now, what are we, a month and a half out? A couple of Sundays before Easter, I believe, Palm Sunday, of Pastor Philip Anthony Mitchell, 2819 Church. Now, listen, let me give some disclaimers. We're going to use his name because it wouldn't make any sense for us to tiptoe around what is the real world reality of this. But I want to make it clear, I'm a pastor, okay? I'm a pastor. I talk about that often on the podcast. Know how hard it is to properly exegete the text and also exegete the culture. So lots of grace, lots of mercy. We're going to speak honestly and candidly. We're also not burying the brother, especially after he apologized, right? Which we'll talk about here in a minute. But I do want to speak honestly about how it made me feel. And Jemar, it's interesting because I listen to a lot of sermons. I probably listen to 7 sermons a week in some way, shape, or form. And sermons are very much so kind of like background noise for me. I enjoy listening how people approach a text. It doesn't have to be on the text that I'm preaching or anything. I just like to listen just for my own personal edification. I like to listen across different denominations, across different styles, different ethnicities, different approaches, different genres of preaching, even from the shorter homilies to the longer sermonic breakdowns. It's been a while since I've listened to a clip of a sermon that made me feel the way that clip made me feel. If you're not familiar with it, Pastor Mitchell was breaking down the passage, "Render unto Caesar." And in doing so, he went on this riff in one of the services. Now, for context, this was their first meeting, their first day in their brand new building, which is super exciting because they've been running into room issues, people flooding into the sanctuary, overflow, having to turn people away. Yeah. I mean, it's rapidly growing in momentum. And so in one of their 4 services, one was actually impromptu service. And one of them, he goes on this riff basically saying, stop blaming white cops for the killing of Black children. Instead, teach your Black children to submit to authority. And he goes on to tell his own personal story of him growing up in New York and being a certain way with a police officer who was riding by or walking by, and that police officer put a gun to his head and said, say something. And he talked about this concept from the idea that, oh, well, if I had responded out of ego, I wouldn't have been here. Right?
How did it make you feel?
I was angry. I was saddened. I was extremely disappointed. I was frustrated because it's clear that he has a massive influence with young Black Christians. How he approaches the scriptures, how he teaches and preaches the word of God, his style, how, I don't want to say nondescript, but kind of how he's fallen into a less flashy, showy expression of pastoral leadership. How he has worn his emotions on his sleeve in a particular way, not necessarily in a fully negative way, but in a way of him basically saying, hey, this is how I really feel. I think it's connected so much with so many people. And I felt like in that moment, so many people's experiences, so many of our experiences were invalidated by an errant comment. Now, being a pastor, I recognize that one comment is not the sum total of a message and can often be taken out of context.
Yes.
And, if you know anything about me, I kind of fire away at the pulpit, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's just kind of how I do it. You know what I'm saying? Like, hey, straight up. But I think the way in which it was felt far different and also factually false, right? And there were so many things to unpack. And so it definitely left me feeling away. I texted the PTM group chat.
Yeah.
And I said, have y'all seen this? Right? We had some pretty lively discussion about what that felt like and looked like. But then so many other people started commenting on it as well. How did you feel when you saw it, heard it?
You said it, disappointed and frustrated. And I was coming from the perspective of, I wish these influential pastors and Black Christian leaders studied more history. So as you said, it's factually wrong. Like, this is demonstrably in error when you look at the history of policing in the United States. When you look at some of the roots of policing come from slave patrols, and you can see pictures of the badges that say slave patrol on them, and it looks exactly like a modern day sheriff's badge.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's always been connected to the control and the brutalization of Black bodies.
Yeah.
No matter how respectful you are of authority. And as a matter of fact, Black parents and community leaders often talk about, quote unquote, the talk.
Yes.
Which is precisely what should have been conveyed, or what could have been conveyed in that sermon, which is the problem of anti-Black policing in this country is so bad that we have to train our children in how to interact with police so that they walk out alive.
Yes.
That's the story. That's the point and the topic. It's not submit yourselves to authority, because so often that authority has not only been wrong and corrupt, it's been lethal.
Yeah.
No matter our behavior, no matter our guilt or innocent, apart from due process. And so these things become readily apparent when you sit down and you study the history and you are focused and you learn it more than by osmosis, which I'm so disappointed that so many of our Black Christian leaders, we know some of the history because we've heard it. But to me, hearing it is different than studying it.
You know what was interesting about the response? I was disappointed and frustrated with the comments, but what made me more disappointed and frustrated, and this is, I think, an overarching statement of what it means to take our role as pastors very seriously, carefully. Whenever we speak, the harm isn't just in what we say. It's in who cheers what we say on.
Interesting.
It's in who celebrates what we say. And it was jarring, Jemar, jarring how many people jumped out of the woodwork. And I'm not talking about white Christians, black Christians who leaped out and said, he didn't say anything wrong. I said, whoa. That was jarring.
Where do you think that comes from? What mindset or mentality are they?
I don't know, other than here's what I would say I think we are experiencing, and this is a separate comment here because I don't know Pastor Mitchell personally, but a separate comment I would make is I think we're seeing a pendulum swing back. The conservativizing of black Christians, we are seeing a much higher percentage of black Christians who are swinging the pendulum from activism, prophetic witness, clearly speaking about the culture, the swinging back to a very, very conservative view of scripture, a conservative view of culture, a conservative view of their faith, and silence on cultural matters, or the cultural expression of white Western Christianity. And it's shocking to me because I would think, I was having this conversation with somebody about it, I was thinking that this next generation would be more radical than us. I was thinking that they wouldn't have to need a 101 for justice. They wouldn't need a 101 for black history. They wouldn't need, you have access to more resources than we ever had. You saw it with your own two eyes. You've seen it. And I see now we cannot assume that.
Do you think that pendulum swing is that a reaction to something? What?
I don't know. I think it is by nature influenced by a couple of things. So I think number one, the movements of justice that we have seen in recent times, modern uprising, civil rights movements, they haven't necessarily worked. And I think for some people, they've been organizing without an ultimate objective. And they haven't actually led to the things that they've desired or wanted. But I think also we cannot deny the reality of what people are hearing in their pulpits, how they're being discipled, what resources they are being given. And if those resources that you are being given are also from people who are publicly supporting the current administration, how do you know any different?
So I think you bringing up a good point is there are multiple perspectives and degrees of helpfulness of those perspectives in every justice movement.
Absolutely.
So we should not be surprised in the 2020s when we have some folks like Pastor Jamal Bryant, Target Boycott, Pastor Charlie Dates, other leaders, Otis Moss III, many others, foregrounding and leading justice, being very explicit and open about that, connecting it to faith and spirituality. I think almost because of that, we should expect a sort of
opposite reaction. Yeah.
Where people are moving away from that and saying it's all about just being holy and living holy lives and all of this other justice stuff. A, it's not effective. B, that's not how we're supposed to respond to authority.
It's extra biblical.
All of that stuff. So we should not be surprised at that. But at the same time, you mentioned the theological aspect.
Yeah.
And the theological colonizing of the black pulpit in some cases.
For sure.
So in the midst of these comments that Philip Anthony Mitchell made, people went back to say, well, where did he get this? Where did he get his training?
Yeah.
And that's something you're familiar with.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a connection, and I don't know how serious it is, how deep it is, but there is a connection to Pastor Rod Parsley and his college.
Break it down.
And Pastor Rod Parsley is a pastor in the Midwest who gained prominence in the TBN era for being a white Pentecostal preacher who had multi-ethnic congregation, who preached in a very Black-ish style, right? I would say Pastor Rod Parsley is the male version of a Pastor Paula White.
That's who I was thinking of.
So like, if you're thinking of that, that's somebody who is, very gifted, very anointed, could use terminology and language, could preach and have all the signs of demonstration that you would see in Black Pentecostal circles, but it was just a white man saying it.
Mm.
I don't know how much influence of that he still holds, but what I will say is Pastor Rob Parsley gave some very insensitive comments, if we're being charitable, during the pandemic post George Floyd. Essentially, and you can look it up, my message to Black pastors or African American pastors,
Good Lord,
literally stood in the pulpit with arms folded and saying, well, what's your alternative to America?
wow.
We are the greatest nation. The founders, what some of you say that the founders owned slaves. Well, they were imperfect. They were just regular men, like you and I. Literally. I mean, you can look it up. And it's still up, shockingly.
That
right?
is unconscionable. It's unconscionable.
So when you think about that and when you consider that, it's hard not to separate root from fruit. And it's hard not to ask that question, how much is that influenced by? But I will give him credit that he did at least put a statement out.
Yes.
And oftentimes, one of the only public comment I made referencing the situation was about the fact that we as pastors often don't, if we say things that are perceived wrong or harmful, we don't apologize and we don't take responsibility and ownership for it. I would have preferred that he would have said that from the pulpit, because I feel like it was necessary to say from the pulpit, the same place where the harm was done, keep the same energy, right? But I'm glad he put out a statement, and I'll read the statement because we're talking about it. He says, in light of statements I made during our 8 a.m. gathering on Sunday, April 13th, I wanted to take a moment to pause and acknowledge the impact of what was said. While not my intention, I recognize I caused harm, and for that, I sincerely apologize. I believe that the passage I preached on presents us with an opportunity to examine our relationship with governments and authority figures, who we may personally oppose, yet have to comply with. Without a doubt, I understand the framing I used about Black children and their relationship with the police was and is harmful. I know that Black people have been killed by the police when being both compliant and non-compliant. I sought to illustrate this tension from my own lived experience via personal testimony. I acknowledge that my framing of that encounter was not helpful and should have been done differently and with more nuance. I would also like to note that the clips of my comments from the gathering have been misconstrued to both aid agendas that I do not seek to align myself with and discredit my heart and my passion for seeing all people saved and walk uprightly before God. I have a responsibility to my local congregation, our digital disciples, and all the people watching me, expecting to see an example of what true discipleship of Christ looks like. That includes acknowledging when you have made a mistake or been wrong. Due to the size of my platform, I'm learning that my words carry more weight and influence than I even sometimes can fathom or acknowledge. I will be more aware and cognizant of that moving forward. Again, I sincerely apologize for any hurt that I've caused. I have prayed for all those affected.
What'd you think?
I really appreciate that he acknowledged that the framing was and is harmful. I appreciate that he connected ownership of this and accountability to this to our discipleship and our walk with Christ. I also appreciate that he called out the way in which those clips have been used to aid agendas or push forward certain schools of thought.
Tell me about that, because I wasn't sure exactly what he was referencing.
There were a lot of people who shared these clips saying, finally, someone has said it. And because you have ultra right wing conservative agendas, they pounce on that opportunity to spread what he has said and basically say, now finally a Black pastor saying it, not too unlike they have used people like Vodi Bakum and others as puppets for their agenda, as puppets for their the way in which they think about us and what they really want to say, but they can't say, because
but one of us said it. So now
one of us said it. So
now
we can use it. Right. And so I appreciate all of that. And again, I wish that would have been done in the pulpit. Maybe it was, and I just didn't see it because I don't watch their stream on a regular basis. But I'm really glad that he acknowledged the hurt and the harm. And I'm glad that he took some time to take a step back and process. And now the question, though, is how do we move differently moving forward? How do we go forward and consider the role that we have as those who control a pulpit, those who have that level of power? How do we steward that well? How do we use it? How do we move differently than what we've moved before? So I think that's a conversation we should have after the break. We'll be right back here on Pastor Mike. Well, greetings and God bless, family. This is your host of Pastor Mike, Tyler Burns, and I am so excited that we're still doing Pastor Mike 11 years after we started. Think about this. 11 years after we started, we're still doing this. And the reason why we can do it is because people like you have supported us from the beginning. We would not still be here if not for the support of people who are our patrons. And if you go to patreon.com/Pastor Mike, if this podcast has helped you in any way, shape, or form, if we've encouraged you to think more deeply about race and justice, if we've inspired you to make change right where you are, if we've been an oasis in the desert in the midst of toxic church spaces, we need your help. We need your support. For just a few dollars every single month, you can keep us going. You literally, as our listeners, keep us going. So head to patreon.com/Pastor Mike. We're passing the mic to you for your support so that we can continue doing this podcast that so many people love. Thank you so much for your support. If you are already a patron, and if you're not, just a few dollars a month. Thank you so much. So we're talking about these comments that Pastor Philip Anthony Mitchell made. And again, we read the fullness of the apology, so we want to give context for that. But as we are processing it, I really see this as a tremendous opportunity. And I hope that as pastors and spiritual leaders, we understand the gravity of our words. I was preaching last year, and the people in this room know some of the situation, but I had a situation with a local pastor who wronged me, who harmed me. And I was talking about how sometimes I don't even remember the text of scripture, but I was talking about how sometimes people can discredit you, right? But God doesn't need people's approval, for him to use you, for him to actually, use you in his kingdom. And I gave so many examples. And so when people say, and before I knew it, I said the words that he said to me, right? And it wasn't like I used his name, or the vast majority of people in the room, almost no one in the room actually knew what was specifically said. This was at my church.
Your church.
No, it's at my church. Yeah. So the vast majority of the people didn't know what was said. We were out of that situation, right? But I said it, and immediately, like, I felt deep, deep conviction. And so I was like, well, like, you did me wrong, and I had to come back the next week, and we had what is our every 6 to 7 weeks at the end of a message, we'll have Q&R. So I have a question response time. So anybody can ask whatever question, text it in, and I'll respond to it, right? So it gives them an opportunity to interact in a different way. And so I said, hey, can I apologize? And I said, the vast majority of you have no idea what I'm referring to, and I'm not going to get into more detail, but what I said was wrong, and I have a responsibility to be pure before you. So I already apologized to the core team, which is our staff. I already apologized to them. I apologized to my wife, and so now I'm apologizing to you that I let my emotions get the best of me in the pulpit. And I realized in that moment, the vast majority of people wouldn't even know what I was talking about. But I also realized that level of power is a massive responsibility to steward, even on a far, far smaller scale than 2819.
Right.
But as I've said here before, and I heard somebody say this, I cannot remember who, so I apologize if I'm taking your thought, but just because I am the pastor doesn't mean I'm the most important person in the room, but it does mean I should be the most responsible. And stewarding that responsibility as a Black pastor in 2025 is multifaceted, multi-layered, but is holy, sacred, and has tremendous weight. And I realized in that moment, I need to take this far more carefully. You can take it seriously, but not take it carefully. You can treat it with seriousness, but not treat it with care. I need to really consider, what am I presenting to the people in the room? And that's caused some deep introspection. And I don't think I've achieved anything by any stretch of the imagination. But what I do think is it has made me consider how something will land in the hearts of the people who will hear it.
And I mean, of course, you think of the passage where not many of you brothers and sisters should become teachers because we'll
keeps me up late at night.
Judged more harshly than the rest.
Keeps me up late at night, my G.
And I think this is an illustration of that, right? We read that passage in the abstract and you're like, okay, yeah, it's serious. And you're talking about the care of it. And I think it's multiplied in the digital age when that clip can be broadcast to literally hundreds of thousands or millions of people.
Yeah.
And so therefore the responsibility for care is even greater. And I think of the human element here, right? Like first you have to think of the people who will hear this message and be led astray. Like that is the core of it. You want to prevent that harm. But another person involved is the person who actually said it.
Yes.
And I think the Bible says to pray for our leaders, all kinds of leaders.
Please.
And I think in particular, as we are looking at this digital age when most sermons are recorded, are available, are broadcast, we need to be paying in a particular way that such levels of attention would not crush the man or woman of God.
Okay, so this gets into the bigger, so we understand the apology, the moment, the harm that was caused, the ownership of it. I think there's other layers to this. We talked about this on a recent episode. It is not normal for your platform and your profile to grow that quickly. Yeah. It's not normal, y'all. And I actually encourage people to take great care about how they are throwing gas on that fire.
Yeah.
Specifically for these statements, and I want to be specific because we're bringing him up, but specifically I've heard this statement so much from younger Christians. Well, he's basically the only person that's preaching the Bible. He's basically like the only popular pastor that's like giving you the raw, unadulterated. Whoa.
We heard this a lot in Reform.
We've heard this a lot in Reform spaces from people who were later revealed to be deeply harmful. Mm-hmm. And my prayer and my hope is that that's not Pastor Mitchell. I'm just saying, be careful.
Yes.
Like we have this obsession with elevating people, specifically men, and elevating us to places that we were not intended, our hearts cannot bear. That literally the elevation of this, the flocking toward this, it's a red flag, not because of the church. It's the red flag because that's what typically happens before people get into a space that actually is really harmful for them. And without knowing anything about 2819, and there's no indication that that's what it is. I'm just saying when people flock towards things, they set themselves up to believe myths about people who are human with clay feet, who you don't even know them that well enough to say it. Just because you listen, if listening to a bunch of sermons doesn't necessarily mean you know the fullness of someone's theology. And this is the thing we don't talk a lot about is people like, oh, that sermon was great. Dope. But you don't actually know someone's full theology or cultural perspective based upon listening to some sermons.
Yeah.
And now people think because they binged a bunch of sermons that all of a sudden now they know exactly, man, the phrase digital disciples strikes me weird. It's catchy.
Got the alliteration.
It's catchy. Preach. And I love the concept of people being able to hear and encourage, but it's also like, you may think you are.
It's a disembodied discipleship.
There's a local church in your area that needs you. Y'all, my city, I can think of off the top of my head, 10 to 12 preachers I know that I would be like, yeah, you can go to their church and be safe. They're going to preach the word. They're going to give you an opportunity. They're going to love you. They're going to encourage you. No, it may not be all the bells and the whistles.
There it is.
No, it may not be all these cultural, they may not fit your cultural mode. No, they may have different styles or opinions on certain things. Yes, it may be a denominational church. But yo, you got a church locally that you can lock in it. And you sitting at home watching because all your friends are watching online and y'all want to talk about it, and that's cool. But at the certain, when you gonna get in the game?
Yeah, and I don't begrudge if that's where people are.
Exactly,
and
sure.
and it's connecting with
We've
you that
talked
way.
about this,
and we don't begrudge if a particular pastor and their communication style, if that's the only thing, keeping you in the faith and holding on to Jesus. We celebrate that. We thank God that God's connecting with you in some type of way, right?
For sure.
What we're
don't
saying,
misconstrue what I'm saying.
Right. And what we're saying is, well, what it reminded me of, we talked in a previous episode about being critical consumers and not just doing stuff out of convenience, right? I think in a similar way, that's in the marketplace. We need to be critical in the church space as well, and examine our own hearts in the sense of, it may be more convenient for me to be a digital disciple, watch this online, but is that the best way?
Yeah.
Is it the best way even for the person that we're listening to and looking up to? Because again, like you said, we're not actually wired as human beings to have this much attention all the time, this fast. That's going to be crushing to anybody.
That's crushing. Yeah.
And we have to sort of sit back and say, what is my part in this? How am I lending to a system that is ultimately dehumanizing, even for this person who is a gifted and skilled communicator and has been so edifying in my walk? And that's not to say you can't tune in, but how you engage.
Yes.
We ought to be circumspect about that and make sure that we ourselves are not becoming a stumbling block for these preachers.
And it's not just him. It's people that it's fill in the blank pastor.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I say this as someone who listens to, again, half a dozen at minimum sermons every week. But you have to be critical consumers of what you listen to.
So what is that? What do you think that looks like? Like, if the folks are listening to this, they're hearing us talk about a specific pastor, a viral clip that went, broad for all the wrong reasons. Yeah. What do we do different? How do we move differently?
So I think one of the things that I've always leaned in is be very careful about, if it's not your local community and you don't actually specifically know the pastor, be very careful about doing a deep scuba dive into one singular person. And the reason why I say that is I think it is important for us. One of my convictions as a pastor is I want to raise, as much as possible, raise up self-aware, versatile disciples of Jesus Christ. And self-aware and versatile means I can actually look at my pastor, go to the church and be like, I don't agree with what he said. If you cannot look at your pastor or the person that you consume the most and admit that you disagree, this was where the unhealthy reaction got to me, is because I said, oh, you can't even admit that you shouldn't have said that. Like, people can't admit, well, he couldn't have said, they're like, don't you realize how hard he's working? And don't you realize like how on fire he is? And if he said it, there's a good reason why he said it and all this. And I'm like, whoa, you should be able to at least admit that even your physical, if people cannot look at, Pastor Tyler kind of wilded out on that. PT was wilding. If you can't say that, I'm like, whoa, like I'm not your pastor, really. Like, you've elevated me to be something almost godlike. I'm a demigod to you. You've deified me. And that's dangerous. So don't scuba dive into one pastor. Be versatile and well-rounded in how you do it. But I think also, we got to read broadly. We have to listen broadly. And I'm taking this a step further than just don't scuba dive into one person. You got to listen to different types of people. Be open. And by being open, you're listening to, it is striking to me how many people will say, and again, I appreciate the critical nature of it, but how many people say, I'll never listen to a sermon by this person. And there's no other reason than what a popular vlogger has said. And I'm like, what? So you're saying, how many people in your local community, how many people in your city have you written off because they didn't fit that perfect mold? But you weren't willing to listen and consume, and you weren't willing to just say, I'm going to be open. Maybe God has something to say to a vessel that I don't necessarily want to hear from. And I feel like that's what polarizes so much of our conversation. But then I think finally, man, and this is really important, listen, consume, develop based upon your personal study of the word,
Mm-hmm.
but you have to do that in community. And if
Yeah.
you're not doing that in community, listen, fam. Everything sounds good when it's just you.
Yes.
A whole bunch of stuff is you go hit.
You brilliant on your own.
You just hit and you just like, man, I'm the first person to ever find. You're not. Right? Like, and if you are, it might be heresy, right? Like, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm the first person to come up with this mindset, and then I flip this into that and all this, and you in the kitchen and you cooking and nobody's eating your food. No, okay, so present it to somebody else and be like, am I tripping? Do you see the same thing? Do you understand the same thing? Are you perceiving it? Maybe I'm off base, but like I felt like when this was said, let's wrestle with it.
Yeah.
We don't just eat it. We wrestle with it. We chew it a little bit. We say, okay, hey, maybe it's not for me. Maybe it connects more with somebody else. Or maybe I really disagree based upon theological, cultural, intellectual perspective. And at the end of the day, what I actually want to do is I don't have to discard that preacher. I don't have to discard that vessel. I can just say I disagree. And I think if we had more of that mentality, rather than turning pastors into people that we're fans of, but actually saying they're servants and they're human servants. And so sometimes they get it wrong, just like I do. But I'm not going to discard them, but I am going to be critical as I listen.
We got to move differently, even when it
Does
comes
that
to
make
listening
sense?
to
I don't know if
sermons.
that makes sense. Does that make sense?
That makes a ton of sense, especially the community part.
Yeah. And I think my hope is that, especially for Pastor Mitchell, number one, that he would find lots of rest. I don't know anything about him, but I pray that he'd have a space to breathe with all these thousands of people that are coming to his church. That's a heavy weight.
Yeah.
I did, man, legitimately. I prayed for him after I heard the clip. I was super upset, and then I prayed for him. Because I was like, I'm sure someone has been that upset with something I've said at some point in time, whether legitimate or illegitimate. But also I pray for him, his family, his community, his church as they try to navigate this, but also all of us, because it's so easy to fall into a trap of elevating our voices, our platform, our name. And so I hope that's a learning experience for him. And I hope it's a learning experience for us as well. We got to move different, you know?
Absolutely.
What do y'all think? I'm assuming nobody's going to have any thoughts about this, right? No comments whatsoever. Hey, leave some comments and tag us in it, all the above. I want to hear what y'all really have to think about this. Hopefully we were fair and honest, and we're not doing, this isn't like necessarily like a theological breakdown as much as it is just kind of a cultural response as Black Christian men. How are we responding to these from a well-orbed perspective? But obviously, we're on YouTube. Leave some comments there. Pass the Mic Podcast. You can always support us by going to patreon.com/passthemic. Just please do not do that. That's simple.
Make it rain.
Cut the camera on
Make
that.
it rain on Patreon.
Cut the camera on that. Do not make it rain.
/passthemic.
Patreon.com/passthemic. And as always, we'll see you soon on the next
Pass the Mic.